Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey, not through bustling markets or grand palaces, but through the quiet, often overlooked corners of everyday life in the Qing Dynasty, specifically. Through its strange and sometimes surprisingly rigid laws. Imagine yourself stepping through a moon gate, the heavy wooden doors groaning softly as they swing inward. You're not quite sure what you're looking for, but there's a distinct feeling that every step, every glance, every idle word might be scrutinized, measured against an invisible rulebook. You might even find yourself in a spot of bother for simply wearing the wrong shade of blue or humming a tune deemed too, well, un-Qing. You probably won't survive this. At least not without a few awkward encounters with the local constabulary. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy history tales travel across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our first stop on this curious tour through the Qing legal landscape brings us face to face with a rather formidable guardian, the imperial edicts. Particularly those concerning forbidden books. You see, during the Qing Dynasty, which stretched from 1644 to 1912, the emperors weren't just concerned with tax collection and military campaigns. They were deeply invested in controlling the narrative. And what better way to control the narrative than to control what people could read, write, and even think? You might imagine a vast, shadowy library where forbidden tomes are locked away, gathering dust, but the reality was often far more immediate and destructive. Books, entire collections, could be declared heretical, subversive, or simply unpleasant by imperial decree. This wasn't just about politically dangerous writings, mind you, although those were certainly high on the list. Sometimes, it was about perceived insults to the ruling Manchu ethnic group, or even seemingly innocuous historical accounts that might, upon closer inspection, contain a subtle criticism of previous dynasties that could be interpreted as a slight against the current one. One mainstream historical fact about this period of literary inquisition, known as the Literary Inquisition, or Wenziyu, is the infamous Siku Quan Shu project. While presented as a grand effort to compile and preserve all significant Chinese texts, it was simultaneously a monumental act of censorship. Imperial scholars diligently copied hundreds of thousands of volumes, but many more were systematically identified, confiscated, and utterly destroyed. Think of it as the ultimate state-sponsored book club, but with a very aggressive, on recommendation, policy. You can almost hear the rustle of silk robes as officials, perhaps with a slight sigh, sign off on the bonfire of a particularly unsuitable poetry collection. Now for a quirky tidbit, sometimes the reasons for a book being banned could be incredibly petty. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal but certainly indicative of the era's paranoia, of a scholar whose work was condemned because it used a certain character that happened to be part of the emperor's personal name. It was considered an act of profound disrespect, an unpardonable offense. Imagine dedicating your life to scholarship, only for your magnum opus to be reduced to ashes because you accidentally shared a syllable with royalty. It makes your forgotten library finds seem rather quaint, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the literary inquisitions were primarily motivated by genuine ideological concerns or if they were largely a cynical tool for consolidating Manchu power by suppressing Han Chinese intellectual dissent. Was it about maintaining order, or was it about erasing alternative histories and opinions? The lines, as always, are blurred, like ink bleeding on ancient paper. You can almost feel the weight of those unspoken words, those lost stories, hovering in the air. The silence where a book once stood, now just an empty space on a dusty shelf. From the weighty matters of forbidden texts, we now gently drift into the fascinating, and frankly quite particular, world of fashion faux pas in the Qing Dynasty. You might think, what's the big deal about clothes? Well, in Imperial China, Your attire wasn't just a personal choice. It was a carefully curated statement of your social standing, your profession, and even your loyalty. Imagine stepping out of your humble abode, perhaps a cozy courtyard house, only to realize you've inadvertently donned a color reserved for imperial family members or a pattern meant only for high-ranking officials. Suddenly, your morning stroll becomes a very tense walk. Doesn't it? These weren't just guidelines. They were sumptuary laws, strict regulations dictating who could wear what, where, and when. The ruling Manchu elite, after conquering the Ming Dynasty, were particularly keen on enforcing their own dress codes, most notably the Q hairstyle for men, that distinctive braided pigtail. This wasn't just a new haircut. It was a profound symbol of submission to Qing rule. Refusal to adopt the Q could be, and often was, considered an act of rebellion, punishable by death. So, while you might be internally debating whether to go with a messy bun or a sleek ponytail today, your Qing counterpart faced a choice with much higher stakes: Q or beheaded. It's a bit more dramatic than a bad hair day, wouldn't you agree? One mainstream historical fact is that the imposition of the Q sparked considerable resistance, especially in the early years of the dynasty. Many Han Chinese preferred death to what they saw as a humiliating symbol of foreign subjugation, leading to numerous rebellions and massacres. It was a visible, constant reminder of who was in charge. You can almost hear the barbers of the time, scissor in hand, asking, "So, what'll it be today? The usual or freedom?" Now for a quirky tidbit. Beyond the big-ticket items like the Q, there were incredibly detailed regulations on colors, materials, and even the number of buttons one could have on a garment. For example, specific shades of yellow and crimson were reserved exclusively for the emperor. Wearing imperial yellow, even by accident, was an extremely dangerous fashion choice. You might think it's a lovely sunny shade, perfect for brightening your day, but in Qing China, it was a fast track to severe punishment. Imagine a modern-day scenario where wearing a certain brand's logo without being an employee gets you arrested. That's kind of the vibe. You wanted to make sure your silk was the right kind of silk, and your embroidery didn't accidentally mimic a forbidden imperial dragon. Historians still argue whether the Qing's insistence on the Q and other Manchu sartorial elements was primarily a means of cultural subjugation, aimed at eroding Han identity, or if it was a more pragmatic strategy for establishing a clear visual hierarchy and ensuring obedience. Was it about forced assimilation, or simply a very effective way to identify friend from foe? Loyal subject from potential rebel? The debate continues, much like the slow unraveling of a meticulously embroidered silk robe. You feel the texture of the cloth, the subtle sheen of the threads. Each stitch a tiny regulation. From the sartorial strictures, we now turn to another surprisingly regulated aspect of Qing life: forbidden foods. You might imagine a vast imperial banquet, tables groaning under the weight of exotic delicacies, but even in this seemingly limitless display of culinary excess, there were rules, taboos, and outright prohibitions. It wasn't just about what you could eat, it was about what you couldn't, and the consequences of transgressing these culinary laws could be surprisingly severe. Imagine accidentally serving the emperor a dish prepared with an ingredient deemed unclean or unlucky. Your career, and perhaps even your life, might depend on the imperial palate's whims. The Qing emperors, particularly those of Manchu origin, were keen to maintain their cultural traditions, and this extended to their diet. Certain foods, considered essential to Manchu identity, were often given preferential treatment, while others, associated with the preceding Ming dynasty or perceived as foreign, might be viewed with suspicion. You might be craving a spicy Sichuan dish, but if it contained an ingredient deemed too southern or Ming-like, you might find yourself facing some raised eyebrows or worse. It's a bit like a modern-day office potluck, but with much higher stakes and a very strict no outside cuisine policy. One mainstream historical fact is that the Qing emperors were particularly fond of game meats, a reflection of their nomadic heritage. Hunting expeditions were not just recreational. They were important displays of Manchu martial prowess and a way to procure specific delicacies for the imperial table. You can almost hear the rumble of hooves and the cries of hunting falcons as the emperor and his entourage pursue their quarry across the vast plains, ensuring a steady supply of proper Manchu fare. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were even regulations surrounding the preparation of food. Certain cooking methods, utensils, or even the direction in which a dish was placed on the table could be laden with symbolic meaning, and a misstep could be interpreted as a sign of disrespect. Imagine a chef painstakingly arranging a plate of dumplings, only to be reprimanded for placing them in the inauspicious direction. It's like a highly choreographed culinary ballet, where every movement must be precise and every ingredient accounted for. Historians still argue whether these culinary restrictions were primarily about maintaining Manchu cultural identity, a way of distinguishing themselves from the Han Chinese majority, or if they served a more practical purpose, such as ensuring the emperor's safety by controlling the ingredients and preparation methods of his food. Was it about cultural preservation, or a very elaborate form of food safety? The debate continues, as rich and complex as a multi-course imperial banquet. You can almost taste the subtle flavors, the carefully balanced textures. Each dish a carefully constructed statement of power and tradition. Having navigated the surprisingly complex world of imperial dinner tables, let's now tiptoe into the equally intricate domain of marriage and family rules during the Qing dynasty. You might assume that matters of the heart and home were purely private affairs. But in Qing China, the state had a remarkably long reach, extending its grasp into the most intimate aspects of domestic life. Imagine planning a wedding, only to discover that the date, the guest list, and even the very notion of who you could marry were all subject to a labyrinthine set of laws and social norms. It was less about romantic love and more about strategic alliances and maintaining social order, almost like a very long, very complicated game of chess, but with actual human pieces. The Confucian ideals that underpinned Qing society placed immense emphasis on family hierarchy, filial piety, and the continuation of the family line. This meant that marriages weren't just unions between individuals. They were crucial arrangements between families, often orchestrated by elders with practical considerations, like wealth, status, and lineage, taking precedence over personal affection. You might dream of eloping with your beloved, but such an act would likely be considered a grave affront to your family and society, potentially leading to disinheritance, ostracization, or worse. It makes navigating modern dating apps look like a walk in the park, doesn't it? One mainstream historical fact is the practice of arranged marriages, which was the predominant form of marital union across all social strata. While the groom's and bride's families exchanged gifts and consulted auspicious dates, the young couple themselves often had little to no say in the matter. You would simply be told whom you were to marry, and that was that. It was less a proposal and more a preordained destiny, often sealed before you could even properly articulate your own name. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were specific prohibitions against marrying individuals with the same surname, especially if they belonged to certain major clans. This wasn't just about preventing incest, but also about maintaining a broader social fabric and preventing powerful clans from becoming too interconnected and influential. So, if you met someone charming at the local market, your first question might not be about their interests, but about their ancestral name. Imagine falling head over heels for someone, only to discover their last name is, let's say, Smith, and you're also a Smith, and suddenly your romantic comedy turns into a historical tragedy. Historians still argue whether the stringent marriage and family laws primarily served to reinforce patriarchal control and ensure social stability, or if they also provided a hidden layer of protection for individuals by embedding them within a supportive, albeit restrictive, familial and communal structure. Was it about oppression, or a form of communal safety net? The debate continues, much like the gentle rustle of silk robes at a long-ago wedding, where duty often overshadowed desire. You feel the weight of tradition. The unspoken expectations, shaping every decision. Having explored the intricate regulations of marriage and family, we now turn our attention to a particularly precarious aspect of Qing life. Speech and slander. You might think that in a vast empire, a few whispered words or a carelessly penned poem wouldn't stir much trouble. But in the Qing dynasty, language was power, and controlling it was paramount. Imagine living in a world where an offhand remark, a poorly chosen metaphor, or even a subtle critique veiled in historical allegory could land you in deep trouble. It was a time when words truly could kill, making casual conversation feel like a minefield. The Qing rulers, especially the Manchu emperors, were acutely sensitive to any form of dissent, real or imagined. The fear of rebellion and the desire to maintain absolute authority meant that expressions deemed seditious, disrespectful, or even just mildly critical of the government or the imperial family were severely punished. This extended beyond outright revolutionary calls. It encompassed anything that could be interpreted as undermining the legitimacy of the dynasty. So, if you were discussing the weather with a friend, you'd best be sure your complaints about the rain didn't accidentally sound like a veiled criticism of the heavens, which, by extension, reflected upon the emperor. Talk about walking on eggshells. One mainstream historical fact is the sheer number of literary inquisitions, or wenziyu, as we touched upon earlier, that targeted scholars and officials for their writings. These weren't just about banning books. They were about prosecuting the authors and often their families for supposed insults, sedition, or treason embedded in their texts. A single character, a turn of phrase, a historical allusion could be scrutinized and twisted into evidence of malicious intent. You can almost picture the imperial censors, magnifying glass in hand, poring over ancient manuscripts, searching for that one incriminating word. Now for a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, the accusations of slander could stem from seemingly innocent coincidences. There's an account of a scholar whose work was condemned because his personal name, or a character within it, happened to resemble a taboo character in the emperor's name, or a politically sensitive term. It wasn't about what he said, but how his identity intersected with imperial sensibilities. Imagine being accused of treason because your nickname sounds a bit like the president's dog's name. It's that level of absurd, yet deadly, paranoia. Historians still argue whether the severity of these laws against speech and slander was a sign of imperial weakness and insecurity, indicative of a regime constantly fearing its overthrow, or if it was a calculated and effective strategy for maintaining stability and consolidating power over a vast and diverse empire. Was it born of fear, or shrewd political calculus? The debate echoes through the quiet halls of history, a constant reminder of the power of words, both spoken and forbidden. You feel the silence where free thought once dared to exist, replaced by a cautious, quiet conformity. Having tread carefully through the perilous landscape of forbidden words, we now turn our attention to the more tangible, yet equally regulated realm of property and land in the Qing dynasty. You might imagine a bustling marketplace where land changes hands freely, or a quiet village where ancestral plots are passed down without question. But in Qing China, the ownership and use of land were deeply intertwined with imperial authority, social hierarchy, and a complex web of customary laws. Imagine trying to expand your tiny farm, only to find yourself entangled in a bureaucratic maze of deeds, taxes, and ancient family claims. It was less about simple purchase and more about navigating a historical minefield. Land was the lifeblood of the agrarian Qing Empire, the primary source of wealth and stability. This meant that the government had a keen interest in how it was distributed, inherited, and taxed. While private land ownership existed, it was always subject to imperial oversight and various levies. Furthermore, different types of land, such as paddy fields, dry land, or communal forests, often had distinct regulations governing their use. You might think of your property rights as straightforward, but in Qing China, those rights often came with a long list of caveats and obligations. It's a bit like having a complex lease agreement that was written centuries ago and keeps changing based on who's in charge. One mainstream historical fact is the equal field system which, while not strictly enforced in the Qing as it was in earlier dynasties, still influenced ideals of land distribution, particularly in certain regions or during periods of land reform. The concept was that land should be distributed more equitably among peasants, though in practice, large landholdings by powerful gentry and officials remained common. You can almost see the dusty scrolls, enumerating fields and families, attempts at order in a vast, sprawling empire. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were often specific regulations about the trees on your land. Certain species might be reserved for imperial use, like particular types of timber for palace construction, or there might be rules about how many trees you could fell, or if you had to replant. Imagine needing to cut down a tree on your own property, only to discover you need special imperial permission, or face a fine because it was a royal tree. It makes complaining about zoning laws seem rather trivial, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the Qing land policies were primarily designed to ensure agricultural productivity and tax revenue for the state, or if they were also a subtle mechanism for controlling the population by tying them to specific plots of land and preventing mass migration or accumulation of too much wealth by local elites. Was it about economic efficiency or social control? The debate continues, much like the slow, steady growth of rice in a field, rooted firmly in the earth of tradition and law. You feel the soil beneath your feet, knowing that every inch is accounted for, every harvest watched. From the unyielding soil of land laws, we now transition to the bustling, yet equally regulated world of trade and commerce in the Qing dynasty. You might envision a vibrant Silk Road, overflowing with exotic goods and entrepreneurial spirit. While there was indeed a rich tapestry of trade, it was far from a free-for-all. Imagine trying to set up a small stall in a busy market, only to find yourself navigating a maze of permits, guild memberships, and prohibitions on what you could even sell. It was less about capitalist freewheeling and more about state-managed prosperity, a carefully orchestrated dance of supply and demand. The Qing government, like many imperial powers, viewed commerce as a vital, but potentially disruptive, force. They sought to control it to ensure tax revenue, maintain social order, and prevent the rise of overly powerful merchant classes who might challenge imperial authority. This meant strict regulations on everything from the quality of goods to the routes of trade, and even the social standing of merchants themselves. You might think of entrepreneurs as risk-takers, but in Qing China, their biggest risk might have been inadvertently offending a local official or breaking an obscure trading law. It's like playing a board game where the rules change every time you land on a new square. One mainstream historical fact is the prominence of guilds, hangui. These were powerful associations of merchants and artisans, often organized by specific trades or regional origins. They regulated prices, apprenticeships, and standards, and also served as a means for the government to control and tax commercial activities. You can almost hear the low hum of collective bargaining, the clink of coins, and the careful negotiations of these powerful groups, shaping the economic landscape. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were often strict prohibitions on certain luxury goods for commoners. While the wealthy elite could indulge in imported silks and rare ceramics, ordinary people were often forbidden from owning or displaying such items, as they blurred the lines of social distinction. Imagine saving up for months to buy a beautiful porcelain vase, only to be told it's too fancy for your social station and confiscated. It makes your credit card statements look like a walk in the park. Historians still argue whether the Qing's commercial regulations were primarily designed to foster internal stability and economic growth through controlled trade, or if they stifled innovation and prevented China from developing a more robust capitalist economy that could compete with burgeoning Western powers. Was it about managed growth or economic stagnation? The debate continues, much like the slow drift of a merchant ship, its sails filled with the winds of regulation, its cargo carefully documented. You feel the weight of the goods, the unseen hand of authority guiding every transaction. From the carefully controlled bustle of trade, we now shift our gaze to the quieter, yet equally policed realm of public order offenses. You might imagine wandering through a Qing city, enjoying a stroll, perhaps a street performance, without a care in the world. But in this era, simply existing in public space came with a surprising number of unspoken, and sometimes very explicitly spoken, rules. Imagine being reprimanded for singing too loudly, or for gathering with too many friends in a public square. It wasn't just about preventing riots. It was about maintaining a pervasive sense of decorum and control. The Qing authorities were acutely aware that even minor disturbances could, if left unchecked, escalate into larger social unrest. Therefore, laws regarding public behavior were designed to prevent any breach of peace, from the seemingly trivial to the genuinely disruptive. This included prohibitions on gambling in public, disorderly conduct, engaging in unauthorized public assemblies, and even noise pollution. So, if you were planning a lively street party, you'd better make sure you had official permission. And perhaps a very understanding local magistrate. It's a bit like living under a very strict neighborhood watch, but with far more severe penalties for a late-night barbecue. One mainstream historical fact is the pervasive system of baojia and lijia mutual responsibility groups. These were local administrative units where families were organized into groups, and members were held collectively responsible for the good conduct of others within their group. If one person committed a crime, the whole group could face consequences, including public shaming or fines. You can almost feel the eyes of your neighbors, not just friendly glances, but watchful gazes, ensuring everyone stayed within the lines. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were often specific regulations about fortune-telling and street performances. While some forms were tolerated, others were viewed with suspicion as potential breeding grounds for dissent or scams. Imagine setting up your little stand to read palms or juggle, only to find yourself on the wrong side of the law because your predictions were too vague or your juggling act too mesmerizing. It makes obtaining a street performer's license today seem wonderfully uncomplicated. Historians still argue whether these stringent public order laws were primarily a necessary measure for governing a vast and potentially unruly population, ensuring day-to-day stability, or if they were a tool for suppressing any form of spontaneous public gathering that might evolve into a challenge to authority. Was it about maintaining peace, or about preventing assembly? The debate continues, much like the distant murmur of a crowd, carefully monitored, every voice accounted for. You feel the subtle pressure to conform, to blend into the quiet hum of imperial order. Section 9. Shifting from the confines of urban public order, we now venture into the less settled, but no less regulated, territories of frontier restrictions during the Qing Dynasty. You might imagine vast, untamed wildernesses where hardy pioneers could simply pack up and settle wherever they pleased. But even on the edges of the empire, the imperial hand made its presence felt. Imagine wanting to move your family to a promising new plot of land near the Mongolian steppes, only to find that such a relocation is forbidden, or that interaction with certain ethnic groups is strictly controlled. The frontier was not just a geographic boundary, it was a carefully managed zone. The Qing government had complex strategic reasons for controlling its borders and frontier regions. This involved managing relations with various nomadic tribes, preventing illicit trade, maintaining military security, and sometimes, ironically, protecting the very lands they had conquered from encroachment by their own Han Chinese subjects. The Manchus, being a frontier people themselves, understood the dynamics of these regions intimately. So, while you might dream of striking out west for new opportunities, your Qing counterpart would first need to navigate a web of permits, quotas, and outright prohibitions. It's a bit like trying to cross an international border without a passport. But the border is invisible and the rules are constantly shifting. One mainstream historical fact is the willow palisade, a system of ditches and embankments, often planted with willows, that separated Manchuria, the Manchu homeland, from Han Chinese settlement. This wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a legal and demographic one. Designed to preserve the Manchu heartland and prevent large-scale Han migration into it. You can almost see the long, winding line, disappearing into the mist. A physical manifestation of imperial policy. Now for a quirky tidbit. Sometimes these restrictions were less about grand strategy and more about controlling access to specific natural resources. For example, certain forests might be designated imperial hunting grounds or sources of specific timber, with severe penalties for unauthorized entry or resource extraction. Imagine trying to collect firewood for your winter stove, only to stumble upon a sign warning you that this entire forest is reserved for the emperor's personal pheasant hunt. It makes your current national park regulations seem quite lenient, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the Qing's frontier policies were primarily a defensive measure to secure their borders and cultural identity, or if they were an economic tool to control valuable resources and labor, especially in areas rich in minerals or strategic trade routes. Was it about security, or economic exploitation? The debate continues, much like the whispered tales of forbidden paths and unseen watchful eyes along the distant horizons. You feel the vastness of the land, yet also the invisible lines that divide and control it. From the distant frontiers, we now draw closer to the heart of the empire, examining the incredibly strict regulations governing official conduct. You might imagine a bustling imperial court, filled with dedicated public servants diligently working for the good of the realm. But in Qing China, the life of an official, from the humblest district magistrate to the highest-ranking minister, was governed by an astonishingly detailed and unforgiving set of laws designed to prevent corruption, ensure loyalty, and maintain the hierarchical order. Imagine waking up each morning, knowing that every decision, every interaction, and every penny you earned was scrutinized for even the slightest deviation from imperial decree. It was less a career path and more a tightrope walk over a very deep chasm. The Qing emperors were acutely aware of the potential for corruption and abuse of power within their vast bureaucracy. Consequently, laws were put in place to regulate everything from the acceptance of gifts to the appointment of relatives, and even the mourning periods for deceased parents, which could require an official to temporarily leave their post. The consequences for transgressing these rules were severe, ranging from demotion and dismissal to exile, imprisonment, or even execution. So, if you were an official, you'd be less worried about meeting your quarterly targets and more concerned with avoiding any appearance of impropriety. It's like having a job where your every lunch receipt is audited by a hypervigilant dragon. One mainstream historical fact is the rule of avoidance, WIBI, which stipulated that officials could not serve in their home provinces or districts. This was a deliberate measure to prevent officials from building local power bases, engaging in nepotism, or showing favoritism to their own families and clans. You can almost see the officials being shuffled across the vast empire, packing their bags, leaving behind familiar landscapes for distant, unfamiliar postings, all in the name of impartial governance. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were specific regulations regarding the clothing and accoutrements of officials, not just for status, but also for specific functions. For example, during certain ceremonies or imperial audiences, particular hats, belts, or even the placement of small pouches could be prescribed, with deviations noted. Imagine being a high-ranking official, only to be chastised for wearing the wrong-colored button on your ceremonial robe. A detail that could be interpreted as a subtle act of disrespect. It makes your modern office dress code seem wonderfully informal. Historians still argue whether the Qing's elaborate system of official regulations was primarily effective in curbing corruption and ensuring honest governance, or if it inadvertently created an environment of fear and formality that stifled initiative and encouraged circumvention. Was it a robust control mechanism, or did it foster a culture of bureaucratic paralysis? The debate continues, much like the slow, deliberate procession of officials entering the Forbidden City, each step measured. each gesture calculated. You feel the immense weight of responsibility, and the ever-present threat of imperial displeasure, steering away from the exacting standards of official life. We now delve into the intricate, and sometimes volatile world of religious regulations in the Qing dynasty. You might imagine a land where people practice their faiths freely, perhaps with a quiet temple in every village. But in Qing China, spiritual life, much like every other facet of existence, was subject to imperial oversight and a complex set of laws designed to promote harmony, prevent dissent, and critically, manage the influence of foreign ideas. Imagine trying to openly practice a faith that the government viewed with suspicion, or attempting to build a new place of worship without the proper permits. It was less about absolute freedom of belief and more about carefully controlled coexistence. The Qing emperors, while often personally adhering to Tibetan Buddhism, especially the Manchu emperors, generally embraced a pragmatic approach to other religions, primarily Confucianism, Taoism, and popular folk beliefs. However, they were deeply wary of anything that could challenge their authority, lead to social instability, or introduce external influences they couldn't control. This applied particularly to new or rapidly growing sects, as well as to foreign religions like Christianity, which was often viewed with suspicion due to its external loyalties and perceived subversive potential. So, if you were considering joining a new spiritual movement, you'd best check its official approval status first. It's a bit like joining an unofficial club that might suddenly be declared illegal. One mainstream historical fact is the repeated prohibitions against Christianity, particularly after the rights controversy in the early 18th century. The Qing court viewed Jesuit and other Catholic missionaries' insistence on the sole authority of the Pope over traditional Chinese ancestor veneration as a direct challenge to imperial sovereignty. This led to periods of intense persecution and the expulsion of many foreign missionaries. You can almost hear the fervent debates, the clash of worldviews, as two powerful systems of belief struggled for dominance. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were often specific regulations about the size and prominence of religious buildings. A temple in a bustling city might be permitted, but its design, height, and even the number of guardian lions at its gate could be prescribed to ensure it didn't overshadow imperial structures or assert too much influence. Imagine wanting to build a grand pagoda to honor your ancestors, only to be told it's too tall, too ornate, or simply too attention-grabbing for your social standing. It makes modern building permits seem like a mere formality. Historians still argue whether the Qing's religious policies were primarily a pragmatic attempt to manage social diversity and prevent conflict within a multi-ethnic empire, or if they were ultimately a tool of state control, aimed at stamping out any belief system that couldn't be easily integrated into the existing imperial framework. Was it about harmony or absolute control? The debate continues, much like the faint echo of chanting from a distant temple, its practices carefully observed, its loyalties questioned. You feel the presence of unseen deities, and the very visible hand of earthly power. Having explored the nuanced regulations surrounding faith, we now turn our attention to the subtle, yet incredibly strict, world of social interactions in the Qing dynasty. You might imagine a bustling marketplace where people from all walks of life mingle freely, or perhaps a tea house where lively discussions unfold without inhibition. But in Qing China, every interaction, from a simple greeting to a formal ceremony, was governed by an unspoken, yet rigidly enforced, code of conduct based on one's social status. Imagine inadvertently addressing someone of higher rank too casually, or failing to show the proper deference to a senior family member. It was less about friendly banter and more about a continuous performance of respect and hierarchy. Like an elaborate dance where every step is choreographed. Qing society was deeply stratified, with clear distinctions between scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants, and even finer divisions within these categories. Laws and customs reinforced these hierarchies, dictating everything from who bowed to whom, to the seating arrangements at a banquet, and even the language used in address. To violate these norms was not just a social gaffe, it could be interpreted as a challenge to the established order, potentially leading to public humiliation, a loss of face, or even legal repercussions. So, if you were meeting someone new, your first thought wouldn't be, "What's their name?" but, "What's their status?" It's a bit like a complex social algorithm running constantly in the background of every conversation. One mainstream historical fact is the profound influence of Confucian ethics on everyday social interactions. Concepts like filial piety, respect for elders and ancestors, loyalty to the emperor and one's superiors, and propriety, correct behavior in all situations, formed the bedrock of social conduct. These were not just abstract philosophies. They were actively taught, enforced, and expected in every aspect of life. You can almost hear the gentle murmur of classical texts being recited, instilling these values from childhood. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were specific etiquette rules regarding gift giving and receiving. It wasn't just about the gift itself, but the manner in which it was presented and accepted. Declining a gift too abruptly, or accepting one too eagerly, could be seen as impolite, or even suspicious. Imagine trying to exchange Secret Santa gifts, only to realize there's a centuries-old manual dictating the precise angle at which you must extend your arm, and the exact phrase you must utter. It makes your polite, "Oh, you shouldn't have," seem incredibly simple. Historians still argue whether these intricate social rules primarily serve to maintain harmony and order by clearly defining roles and expectations, or if they stifled individual expression and perpetuated rigid class distinctions, making social mobility incredibly difficult. Was it about societal cohesion or control? The debate continues. Much like the quiet rustle of sleeves as individuals navigate the delicate currents of social hierarchy, each gesture a silent conversation of status. You feel the subtle weight of tradition, shaping every smile, every nod, every polite refusal. From the subtle dances of social interaction, we now move to a more tangible, yet surprisingly regulated, aspect of Qing life: animal control. You might imagine a rustic scene with chickens pecking freely in a village courtyard, or oxen patiently plowing fields without much interference. But in Qing China, even the presence and behavior of animals, from the humblest livestock to exotic imperial beasts, were subject to specific laws and imperial decrees. Imagine your neighbor's dog barking incessantly, only to find that reporting it involves a complex bureaucratic process, or that owning a certain type of bird requires a special permit. It was less about casual pet ownership and more about managing a living ecosystem under the imperial eye. The Qing government had various reasons for regulating animals. This included ensuring public health, preventing the spread of disease from livestock, maintaining agricultural productivity, protecting crops from pests, controlling imperial hunting grounds, and even managing the symbolism associated with certain animals. Furthermore, the use of animals in transport, warfare, and entertainment also fell under governmental purview. So, if you were a farmer, you'd be less worried about your prize pig escaping and more concerned about whether it met specific imperial breeding standards. It's a bit like an ancient version of animal control, but with more silk robes and less modern veterinary science. One mainstream historical fact is the extensive use of horses by the Manchu rulers, reflecting their nomadic heritage. Horses were not just vital for military campaigns and transportation, they were also bred and managed under strict imperial supervision, with specific pastures and stable regulations. You can almost hear the thud of hooves on packed earth, the whinny of well-groomed steeds, signifying imperial power and mobility. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were often specific prohibitions on slaughtering certain animals or performing certain acts of animal cruelty, not always for humanitarian reasons, but often due to religious beliefs or practical considerations. For example, some Buddhist principles influenced a general aversion to unnecessary killing, though this often coexisted with the realities of meat consumption. Imagine trying to prepare a feast, only to be told that the pig you plan to roast can only be slaughtered on a specific day, or in a specific manner to avoid offense. It makes your modern ethical sourcing questions seem relatively straightforward. Historians still argue whether these animal regulations were primarily a pragmatic response to the challenges of managing a vast agrarian society, ensuring resource stability and public health, or if they were also a reflection of deeper cultural and religious beliefs that imbued certain animals with symbolic or spiritual significance. Was it about efficiency or reverence? The debate continues. Much like the distant lowing of cattle or the flight of a hawk against the setting sun, each creature part of a meticulously ordered world. You feel the presence of living beings, each constrained by unseen boundaries. Having explored the nuanced rules surrounding animals, we now come to a particularly restrictive, and often frustrating, aspect of Qing life: curfew and movement. You might imagine the freedom to wander through a city street at any hour, or to travel between towns whenever you pleased. But in Qing China, your ability to move about, especially after dark or during specific events, was tightly controlled by imperial decrees. Imagine trying to visit a friend across town after sunset, only to find the city gates locked and patrols enforcing a strict curfew. It was less about personal liberty and more about maintaining constant surveillance and order. Like living in a city that periodically hits the pause button. The Qing government implemented curfews and restrictions on movement for various reasons, including preventing crime, suppressing potential uprisings, managing large gatherings, and ensuring public safety during times of crisis or celebration. City gates were often locked at night, and patrols would enforce strict adherence to the curfew, with severe penalties for those caught outside without legitimate reason. So, if you were planning a late-night snack run, you'd better make sure you had an official permit, or a very good hiding spot. It's a bit like a permanent game of hide-and-seek, but the seekers had swords and the stakes were considerably higher. One mainstream historical fact is the common practice of city gates being locked at nightfall, a feature in many Chinese cities throughout history, including the Qing. This wasn't just for security. It also demarcated the rhythm of urban life, segmenting the day into periods of activity and enforced quiet. You can almost hear the heavy clang of the gates as they swung shut, sealing off the city from the outside world and its inhabitants within its walls. Now for a quirky tidbit: during certain festivals or imperial ceremonies, movement might be even more restricted, with specific routes designated for parades or imperial processions, and all other streets cleared and secured. Imagine trying to go about your daily errands during a major imperial event, only to find your usual route blocked by hundreds of guards, forcing you on a lengthy detour through an unfamiliar part of the city. It makes navigating rush-hour traffic seem like a serene meditation. Historians still argue whether these stringent movement restrictions were primarily an effective tool for preventing crime and maintaining public order, or if they were also a means of social control, limiting the spontaneous assembly of people, and thus reducing the potential for organized dissent. Was it about security or suppression? The debate continues, much like the slow, deliberate pace of a night watchman's footsteps, echoing through empty streets, enforcing a silence that speaks volumes. You feel the boundaries, both visible and unseen, that govern every step. From the literal confines of curfews and restricted movement, we now arrive at a more abstract, yet equally pervasive, set of laws concerning cultural preservation. You might imagine a society where traditions naturally evolve, adapting to new influences and tastes. But in Qing China, the imperial government had a vested interest in maintaining what it considered to be the correct customs, rituals, and artistic expressions. Imagine being told that a song your grandmother taught you was now considered inappropriate, or that a style of painting you enjoyed was deemed untraditional and subtly discouraged. It was less about organic cultural development and more about curated cultural continuity, a careful hand guiding the brushstrokes of tradition. The Qing emperors, particularly the Manchu rulers, faced the constant challenge of governing a vast Han Chinese majority while also preserving their own distinct Manchu identity. This led to laws and policies that sought to enforce traditional Confucian values, promote certain forms of art and literature, and even regulate customs like dress, remember the queue? And ancestral rites? The goal was often to prevent perceived moral decay, maintain social order, and reinforce the legitimacy of the imperial system by associating it with a timeless, harmonious cultural heritage. So, if you were a budding artist, your success might depend less on your originality and more on your ability to produce works that adhered to established, imperial-approved styles. It's a bit like a historical art competition where the judges have already decided what good art looks like. One mainstream historical fact is the official promotion of Neo-Confucianism as the orthodox ideology. This philosophical system, emphasizing moral cultivation, filial piety, and loyalty to the state, was deeply embedded in the education system, the imperial examinations, and the legal codes. It wasn't just a philosophy, it was the blueprint for society, shaping every interaction and expectation. You can almost hear the rhythmic chanting of classical texts in schools, echoing the official line. Now for a quirky tidbit. There were often subtle regulations surrounding traditional entertainment, like opera or storytelling. While generally popular, specific narratives or performances that were deemed too overtly critical, morally questionable, or historically inaccurate could be censored or even banned. Imagine your favorite local opera troupe suddenly having their script vetted by imperial censors, removing all the good bits because they might inspire improper thoughts. It makes modern content ratings seem quite flexible. Historians still argue whether these cultural preservation efforts were primarily a genuine attempt to safeguard a rich heritage for future generations, or if they were a deliberate strategy to stifle intellectual freedom and maintain social control by enforcing a narrow, state-sanctioned worldview. Was it about heritage, or hegemony? The debate continues, much like the gentle waft of incense from an ancient temple, where traditions are kept alive, sometimes by decree, sometimes by quiet devotion. You feel the deep roots of custom, stretching back through generations, held firmly in place by a powerful, unseen hand. Word count, 1045. Awaiting continue. And so, as we gently pull back from the intricate tapestry of Qing Dynasty laws, you can almost feel the quiet hum of history settling around you. We've wandered through dusty libraries where thoughts were forbidden, through bustling streets where your clothing spoke volumes, and even into quiet homes where family life was precisely mapped out. You've seen how every aspect of existence, from the grand pronouncements of emperors to the subtle rustle of a silken sleeve, was governed by a meticulous, sometimes baffling, code. The strictures and expectations of the Qing era, while perhaps alien to our modern sensibilities, were designed to maintain an extraordinary sense of order across a vast empire. They paint a picture of a world where every action, every word, every choice had a resonance, a place within a meticulously structured society. You can almost feel the serene stillness of the long imperial night, where the only sounds are the distant call of a night watchman, the gentle creak of ancient timber, and perhaps the soft whisper of the wind through willow trees. As these images begin to soften and blur at the edges, let your mind drift. There's no need to cling to every detail, every forgotten regulation. Just let the gentle hum of forgotten histories wash over you, a soothing presence in the quiet darkness. The world of the Qing Dynasty, with all its strange rules and unexpected intricacies, is now fading into the comforting quiet of your own space. May your thoughts be peaceful, your dreams be deep, and your rest be undisturbed. Sleep well.